We're looking at questions of God over the next couple of weeks. Today we're looking at why does God allow suffering. Next week we'll be looking at what happens about after you die and what goes on there and heaven and all the rest. And then the week after that we're looking at a pandemic really in our society, which is loneliness. And so we'll be looking at those three things. That will lead into Easter. God loves us asking questions. He's not at all threatened by our questions at all. The Bible makes that really, really clear. So we're going to have a look at this question about suffering. And we're going to be spending a bit of time in the Bible. I mean, we always spend time in the Bible, but usually I just pick a passage and we go into that. Whereas today we're going to be going all over the place because I want to really get God's opinion on this whole suffering thing. A few weeks ago, I visited a guy called Ray who'd been in our life group until he and his wife moved up to Caboolture, and his family, actually, some of his family, come to this church as well. And I visited him in hospital, in the Caboolture hospital. And Ray's a great guy. He's been a pastor. He's been a missionary in PNG, he and his wife. And he's a sort of guy that can put his hand to anything. Do you know what I mean? He can do anything that you ask. And he's got a bit of a wicked sense of humour as well, and really, really good guy. I visited him in hospital because he has motor neuron disease. And this disease has now robbed him of so much. He can still talk and give cheek, but he can hardly move. Like he was struggling just to try and touch the button get the nurses in to come and help. He couldn't even move like that. And as I watched Ray there in hospital, it just felt so unfair that he's a great guy, just a guy that's done so well with people and all the rest, and that his life has to end with such suffering. You don't have to look very far, do you, to find suffering? It's all around us. We've all seen it. We've all experienced suffering in some way. Some people, of course, have suffered more than others. And we recognise that. Some of you are really suffering at the moment, either because of things that have happened in the past, or it might be a health situation, or it might be a family situation at the moment. But we all know what suffering is like. We've all experienced it. Sometimes it's individual suffering, so health, family, loneliness, poverty, depression, unemployment. Sometimes it's community suffering, when things happen in our community. Floods recently, cyclones that dropped trees on offices, so there's a community type suffering where we suffer together. And sometimes it's on a global scale and there's just horrific stuff happening in our world, wars and poverty in the Middle East and Africa and Ukraine. So the big question is, why does God allow that to happen? Like, why do people have to suffer? Because we believe that God is a God who is loving and caring, and also a God who is all-powerful, that can do anything that he chooses to do. And so if that's true, then why on earth do we have to suffer? It seems that suffering, this is the argument anyway, seems to say either God doesn't exist, do you know what I mean? So suffering's just a part of life like everything else and you just got to deal with it. Or God exists, but he doesn't really care, so he just allows us to suffer. Or God exists and he cares, but he can't do anything about it anyway. He's stuck, he can't change things, and so we suffer. It seems like one of those seems to be the only possibilities in the whole thing. Why does God allow suffering if he really is all-powerful and if he really is caring and loving? And I'm sure we've all had questions at times about that. You know what I mean? When you suffer yourself, or particularly when you see other people just suffer so dreadfully, unfairly, you sort of think, well, God, where are you in the middle of all this? I remember there was a missionary couple from this church many years ago that went to Southeast Asia, and the suffering they saw was so awful in Southeast Asia that they came back, and it really, really troubled their faith. That people could suffer so greatly, particularly when we in Australia don't suffer as much, or many of us don't suffer as much. So, as you expect, this is not going to be any easy answer this morning, because if there was an easy answer, this would be a very short sermon, and we can't have that. So, there's going to be what I'm going to try and do is talk about how God relates to suffering, and I've got 5 points, all right, about it. The first 2 are going to be the longest, all right, and then the last 3 are a bit shorter. So, but we're going to have a look at 5 ways in which God relates to our suffering. So here we go. The first one is this. God hates suffering. God doesn't want people to suffer. The Bible makes that clear, like in at least 3 ways, more than that, but at least 3 ways. One is when God designed this world, he designed it beautiful. He designed it good. That's what it says in Genesis 1. God saw all that he'd made, and it was very good. So God designed a world that didn't have suffering in it. We were to live in harmony with each other and in harmony with God, and we were to go on living forever. I mean, that was probably God's intention for us. That's what he wanted. So he made a world without suffering in it. The second thing I'd say is that and Alex has already read the verse, when he comes back, when he comes to restore this world, which eventually will happen, then there'll be no suffering there. Alex read the verse from Revelation 21. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. The old order that involves the suffering, that's gone now. And so God he didn't intend this world to be a place of suffering. We'll eventually remake it where there is no suffering. God hates suffering. You see that when Jesus came to this world. You know, Jesus is a Son of God, clearest picture we have of God. When Jesus came to this world, what did he come to do? He came largely to alleviate suffering. That's what it says in Luke 4. The Spirit of the Lord is on me. This is Jesus talking about his ministry right at the start. Because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. So God hates suffering, and he can't wait to take it away. When I saw Ray in that hospital bed, partly I thought, this feels very unfair. But then I thought, God grieves over Ray's suffering as much or more than I do. When God sees little children being trafficked as sex objects, then God sees that and he's horrified by it. He hates suffering. When God looks at the suffering that you have been through or are going through now, he's distraught over it. It's never his intention for his people. He's not unmoved. God is not sort of standing there saying, oh, well, I'm sorry, you just have to put up with that. He grieves over suffering. When Jesus was here in ministry, towards the end of his ministry, he was looking up at Jerusalem and he saw this city. And of course, because he was Jesus, he could look into the future. He knew what was going to happen to Jerusalem. And he knew that the Romans were going to come because of their rebellion. And the Romans were going to come and destroy this city. And the Bible says Jesus cried, like Jesus wept over Jerusalem. He was distraught by that this suffering was going to happen to this group of people. So God hates suffering. So if that's the case, if God hates it, if God dislikes it, if God grieves over it, why on earth did he allow suffering to happen in our world? All right, so this is the hardest point to get across, because what I'm going to say is God allows suffering because he loves us. All right, now that's a pretty hard one to get across, so let me explain what I'm going to say. God could have stopped suffering entering our world. He could that. He had the right to do that. He didn't design it like that, and he could have stopped suffering coming. But the only way he could stop suffering coming to our world is by taking away our free choice, so that we always did what was right. We never had a choice. We always did what God told us to do. And if no one could choose wrong, and if no one could hurt other people, we would have a perfect world, an ideal world where there would be no suffering. But in doing that, God would take away our freedom, our ability to choose, and particularly our ability to love, because love has to be something that you freely give. Our ability to love God, love people. In other words, we would be just robots, just doing what God says, exactly what God wants us to do. So God decided to take a risk and to give us freedom so that we could love him, so that we could love each other, so that we could trust him and do what he says. He gave us freedom. We have free choice. And that's a great gift that God's given us. We can choose. Everyone here can make their own choices and do what they choose and do good and do bad, and we've all done both of those. We do the same thing with our kids, don't we? Like when our kids are little, we try to control them as much as we can. We can't do it, but we try hard to control them, don't we? Do you know what I mean? We try to get them to do the right thing. But as they get older, then there comes points where we've got to release them. You can't control. To try and control your child right through their life would be incredibly unhealthy and stop them growing and developing themselves. And so we give them choice. Sometimes they make the right choices. Sometimes they don't make the right choices. Sometimes you wish you could make decisions for your kids, don't you? Do you know what I mean? Like, I wish I could control this. But in love, we give them freedom. And sometimes they mess that up and make dreadful mistakes and suffer because of that. And sometimes we suffer because of that as well as parents. And sometimes they do beautiful things, far better than what you would dream of or expect. But it's a terrible risk. It's a terrible risk. And it was a risk for God. And similarly, some people, the Bible makes it really clear that when God gave us freedom, we had a freedom to choose. And what happened was people chose to do what they wanted, to go their way rather than trusting in God and loving him and following him. And they chose to make their own decisions and call their own shots. And because of that, a lot of that was messy and dreadful and awful for people, and it deteriorated very quickly at the start. And because of that, suffering entered into our world. Romans 5:12 says, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. And so we've all done it. Do you know what I mean? We've all messed up. You've hurt people. You've been hurt by people, but you've hurt people as well. So we're all part of that. And so we suffer because of God and his love saying, I'm going to give them freedom. I'm going to allow them to make their own choices. Because of that decision of God, then we all suffer. Not because God's caused it, but because we've caused it. So a lot of the suffering that we face is a direct consequence of the poor choices of people around us. Wrong choices, suffering, you could name any sort of suffering, like slaves. There's still slaves in our world today. It's horrific, and thinking that I have a right over someone's life, like how destructive is that? And that causes dreadful suffering. The suffering in the Ukraine and suffering in Congo as a direct consequence of human choices. Some of us suffer because of the choices of our parents. And some of us probably in this church, in this congregation, have been abused in some ways by others. And we've suffered because of that. I'm sure if you're married, you've experienced suffering, because we do. We just rub against each other, don't we? And we make poor choices and we hurt each other. And that's a lot of suffering is caused. And in the workplace, in many places, a lot of our suffering is direct consequences of people making poor choices. And maybe some of us here facing that even right now. So some of the suffering is a result of other people's choices. Some of our suffering is a result of our own choices. And so we suffer because we make poor choices. I have a predilection for chocolates. Do you know what I mean? I really love chocolates. And I just want you to remind you of that because my birthday's coming up, But if I face, long-term diabetes or something like that, I've only got myself to blame, haven't I, really? Because it's chocolates. I love the beach. Do you know what I mean? I spend a lot of time on the beach, swimming and walking, and I just love it. Do you know what I mean? But I know it's not good for my skin. So we make choices, and some of them much more serious than that. Do you know what I mean? But we make choices, and we suffer because of the choices that we make. And some of you are in that boat. People take drugs, and they lose their health, and they lose their income, and that's a result of their choices. Some people live angry throughout their lives and wonder why their children reject them, and that's a consequence of of their choices. Now, we need to be very careful about blaming people for the way things that happen in their lives. We need to be really, really careful about that. But it is true that sometimes suffering is a result of the choices that we make. And sometimes it's just a product of living in a broken world. There's no one's to blame, no one else, not ourselves. It's just because we're living in this world that's been broken by people's choices, and there's a whole lot of consequences of that, And most of us have lost friends that are very close to us in some way or another through disease, particularly through cancer. And we just don't have a perfect world anymore. It's going to be perfect. It was perfect, and it's going to be perfect, but at the moment it's not. And there's cyclones, and and all of us face death. I mean, that's one of the consequences of our choices. So we brought death into this world, and all of us face that, and that is great suffering. So we suffer. When people say, why doesn't God just remove all the suffering? Like he can do it, so why doesn't he do it? The question raises in my mind is do we want God to remove our freedom of choice? Like, do we want God to call the shots for us completely? We've just got to do whatever he says. Do we really want that? And most people don't. I'm actually not so keen about that myself. We appreciate our freedom despite the negative consequences of it. We don't want to be robots. I don't want to be a robot just automatically doing whatever God tells me to do. I want to love God. I want to respond to him. I want to enjoy him and his grace. That's what I want. So we're stuck with suffering and the opportunity for freedom and love that it provides until Jesus says we've had enough time to make our choices. The Bible makes it really clear that eventually Jesus is going to say, that's enough. I'm restoring this world. This is in 2 Peter 3 verse 9. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. So why on earth doesn't he do something about it now? Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. So what the Bible's saying is that Jesus is going to restore this world. He is going to deal with suffering. He is going to remove it forever. But the reason he hasn't done it yet is because he loves people. And he cares about people, and he's waiting for them to respond and build a relationship with him. So that's the second thing. God allows suffering because of his love. All right, point number 3. God works through suffering. Just because God hates suffering and plans to remove it doesn't mean that he just holds it at his arm's length and says, I can't do anything about that. What God does do, again and again and again, is he looks at the suffering and he works through the suffering. He doesn't cause the suffering, but he works through the suffering to bring good things out of it. There's a lot of suffering in the Bible. A lot of the people who serve God and live for God suffered hugely. Let me read to you a couple of them. Here's David. All right, so David was a king of Israel, probably the greatest king of Israel, expanded Israel, did a fantastic job, was an excellent leader. And this is what he says in Psalm 55. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. I said, oh, that I had wings of a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. I would flee far away and stay in the desert. Does that sound familiar to you sometimes? Do you know what I mean? Like, oh God, I can't take any more of this. Oh, that I could just get away from it all. That's David speaking. Let me quote from Paul. It's not up there, but just listen. This is Paul, right? So Paul was a great leader of the church, probably the greatest leader of the church in the New Testament, and wrote a whole lot of the Bible, and just a fabulous leader, great man of God. And this is what he says. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night in the day and day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I've laboured and toiled. I've often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst and often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Right? He's suffered, hasn't he? He's been through it. He knows what suffering is like. So it's not that God says, well, I can't do anything about it, you just got to put up with it. God says, no, no, no. I can work through this. This pain, this thing that I hate in your life, a thing that I long to remove, I can still work through it. I can bless you through it. Let's look at some of the ways that God does that. Sometimes he alleviates the suffering. So in his great compassion and power, sometimes he heals us or takes away the situation that's causing the suffering. Sometimes he does that. And that's why many of us are praying heaps for people that are suffering, because we believe that at times God will take that away. And we've seen that again and again and again. God work in his power and take away the suffering of people. I remember there was this guy in this church that didn't believe. We used to pray a lot, we still do, for healing and all the rest. And this guy didn't believe in praying for healing. He didn't think that God healed, So anyway, that was fine. And then he got throat cancer, and it was pretty serious. He was a singer, actually, and he was pretty serious. And I went round to visit this guy and said, would you like me to pray for healing for you? Now he's caught, isn't he? Do you know what I mean? Like, he doesn't believe in healing, but he's got throat cancer. And so eventually he said, oh, all right. I don't believe it'll do anything, And so I prayed for healing for him, and he was completely healed. You know what I mean? Like, it was just incredible. And I thought, gosh, God is gracious. Here's this guy that doesn't even believe in it, do you know what I mean? And gets healed. So sometimes God does that. And we've seen wonderful answers to prayer, and we praise God for what he does. A lot of times he doesn't. I've prayed for lots of people with cancer and they haven't been healed, all right? I just want to admit that. Don't think that I've got the answer to cancer and all the rest. But sometimes God shows his grace, as he did through Jesus. Do you know what I mean? Just showed his grace to people and love for people and compassion and bring healing. So sometimes God does that. And if you're in the middle of suffering at the moment, we would love to pray for you. We really would, because we believe that sometimes God will work in his power and remove the suffering. Sometimes our suffering, God uses our suffering to show us our need for him. So a lot of our lives, when we're not suffering all that much, we can pretty well do our own thing and do okay. But when we suffer, we realise that we can't make it by ourselves and that we need Jesus. I'm texting with a school principal at the moment. He's in a school, and the school is going fabulous, Christian school. It's going fabulously. Great things are happening there and all the rest. He is suffering dreadfully. He's got a daughter that's incredibly ill. He's got a lot of circumstances in the school. He says it's been his worst start to a school in 18 years as principal. So he's suffering incredibly at the moment, and he said, I just need Jesus. I can't keep doing this if it wasn't for Jesus, And so sometimes God uses our suffering to throw us back onto him and say, hey, I need you, Jesus. So this life has its good parts and it has its tough parts, but I desperately need you. Paul was like that, the guy that I just read about, that went through a lot of suffering. He says in 1 Corinthians 11 that he had this problem. We don't know what it was, but it was a major thing in his life. And he prayed 3 times that God would take it away, and God didn't do it. Instead, God said to him after the 3rd time, I think, he said to him, you can stop praying for that because my grace is made perfect in your weakness. In other words, because you are suffering, because it's difficult for you, you are relying much more on me and my grace. And so sometimes God works through the suffering like that. It just shows us how much we need Jesus. Sometimes God works through the suffering to bring maturity to us, to enable us to grow in ways that we wouldn't be able to without the suffering. Let me read 1 Peter 6. In all this you greatly... 1 Peter 1 verse 6. In all this you greatly rejoice, though for a little while you may have to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that to prove the genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold which perishes even though refined by fire. And so God matures us and grows us and builds our faith in the middle of the suffering. I'm sure you all know people like that. They're the most incredibly beautiful people who have suffered hugely throughout their life. And somehow the suffering has actually grown them and developed them and matured them and brought them closer to Jesus, or made them even more special people because of the suffering that they've been through. And I could name people here in this church that I would see like that. Their suffering has actually grown them and made them more beautiful. Suffering doesn't have to destroy you. It can do the opposite. It can refine you and make you more beautiful. And I could give many examples, but people like in our world that we all know of, like people like Nelson Mandela. Do you know what I mean? Like through incredible suffering, he matured and he grew and he became a man of forgiveness and grace. All of those things. And so sometimes it does that. The fourth thing is that sometimes God uses the suffering to achieve the things that he wants. It feels like suffering at the time, and it is. But through it, God turns things around and makes things happen. Let me give you some examples. There's a guy in the Bible called Joseph. And he was a smart aleck, really, he was. Do you know what I mean? But very talented smart aleck. And his brothers hated him because he was the favourite and all the rest and got everything from the father. So they decided they were going to kill him. Pretty extreme, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? But this is in the Bible. So they decided he's going to kill him. They put him in a pit. And then some slave traders went past. They thought make some money out of it. So they sold him to these slave traders who took him off to Egypt. So he became a slave in Egypt, this young guy. And awful suffering. He worked his way up and then he got accused of adultery and ended up in jail. And he was just suffering after suffering after suffering. The poor guy, do you know what I mean? You think, oh, God's abandoned him. What on earth has happened here? But eventually, he ends up as governor of Egypt. And he put down, because of some visions he has from God and all the rest, he stores up a whole lot of food, and then the whole region goes into a drought. And there's no food anywhere, but Egypt's got all the food, and Joseph's in charge of it all. And his brothers eventually turn up. They don't recognise him, do you know what I mean? But they eventually turn up in Egypt looking for food because they're starving. And Joseph reveals himself to them, and then he says this: "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." In other words, God took something that was dreadful in his life, but used it to produce something that he would never become governor of Egypt if he would have stayed in Israel. So God used it like that. Now again, got to be careful before we too quickly say that. But this is what God does. I've got a mate who's pastoring up at Life Point in Maroochydore, and many of you will be aware of this. Beginning of last year, their church burned down. And it was just a fault. It wasn't an electrical fault. It wasn't anyone's fault or anything like that. But the whole church burned down. And that was awful. Do you know what I mean? They've been meeting in a school. They still are. And they've used little golf buggies to take everyone around, and then the golf buggies get stolen. Do you know what I mean? Like it just goes on and on and on. Do you know what I mean? There's suffering in the whole thing, But they've now got plans for a new church. They've got insurance and all the rest. And they're going to end up with something better than what they had. You know what I mean? Like it's hard for them at the moment. It still is hard for them. Poor old Phil. But they're going to end up with something incredible. And so sometimes God takes us through the suffering to produce something that we would never have been able to get without the suffering. Does that make sense? Yeah. So God works through suffering. Now, we need to be really careful with this, particularly when we see suffering in other people. So don't worry about your suffering. God's going to use that. We don't too quickly. Suffering hurts a lot. It's very tough. And before we say, oh, yeah, God's at work and he's going to mature you and all the rest, we need to sit with people in their suffering and grieve with them and hurt with them, So be careful before we do that too quickly. But I just want to assure you that suffering is not outside what God can use. God actually works through suffering. Fourthly, God will compensate for suffering. Now, perhaps I'm on a little bit of thinner ground here, biblically, but I believe very strongly that God always has always had a heart for the sufferers. Do you know what I mean? Those that are hurting, those that are finding it difficult, those who are outcast. God, right throughout the Old Testament, you find that, same in the New Testament, that God just has a heart for those that suffer. And he longs to compensate them, and he will compensate them for the suffering that they've been through. And sometimes it's in this life, So we've got some examples of that. I mean, Joseph was one that I just talked about. Job was another one. You know, Job, the sufferer, you know, lost everything, family, possessions, all the rest. And then in the end, after a huge amount of suffering, God restored it and gave him twice what he had at the start, you know, except twice as many kids. He only got the same number of kids again. But you know, like God worked in incredible ways, you know, to compensate him. So sometimes it's in this life. And I've seen that. Do you know what I mean? I've seen people that have been, say, abandoned by their spouse, and then eventually they remarry, and the new marriage is better than the old one. Do you know what I mean? Like God compensates them for the pain. It's dreadfully painful, do you know what I mean? But for the pain that been through. So sometimes it's in this world, but a lot of the time it isn't. You know, it isn't in this world. And but God promises that he will compensate eternally for those that have suffered. Let me give you an example. Matthew 5:11. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me, right? That's suffering. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. Great is your reward in heaven. Now, we're talking a little bit about this next week. We're talking when we talk about heaven and what it's like and all the rest, you know what I mean? But I can't get around the fact that God is an incredibly just God. Like he's merciful, gracious God, but he's incredibly just as well. And those of you that have suffered more are likely to get blessed more by God, because God loves to compensate for what you have been through and the way you have suffered. And so God will compensate for suffering. So endure, keep going. This is not the end. God has the final say in all of this. And the last thing I wanted to say, in God's response to suffering, God actually joins us in suffering. All right, so what have we said? God hates suffering. He allows suffering because of his love and his desire to give us freedom. He works through our suffering. He will compensate us for suffering. And lastly, he joins us in suffering. Jesus is the great sufferer. Paul says in Philippians 3:10, I want to know Christ. Yes, to know the power of his resurrection, so I want to see his power at work in my life, and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death. And so as we suffer, we join Jesus in suffering. Let me give you a quote from an anonymous thing online that I've doctored and changed, so probably more me. And this is not perfect, do you know what I mean? But I think it gets a message across. In the end, many groups had complaints against God for the evil and suffering he had permitted in his world. How lucky God was to live in heaven, where all was wonderful and good, where there was no crying or fear, no hunger or hatred. What did God know about of all the people who had been forced to endure in this world? What right did God have to judge anyone? So each of these groups sent a representative, chosen because they'd suffered dreadfully. A Jewish Holocaust victim, a forced Eastern European sex worker, a horribly contorted arthritic, a slave from China, a quadriplegic, an African child soldier. At last they were ready to present their case. Before God could be qualified to be their judge, he should understand what they had endured. If only God knew what it was like to live on earth as a person, to be born as a Jew under a hostile occupation with doubts about the legitimacy of his birth, to be given a work so challenging that even his family would think he was out of his mind, to be misunderstood, hated, criticised and attacked by powerful people despite his love and goodness and grace, to be betrayed by his closest friend and abandoned by his mates, to face false charges, to be tried by a prejudiced jury and convicted by a cowardly judge, to be mocked and ridiculed and horribly bashed and tortured, then to be martyred brutally in his prime, in dreadful shame and agonising pain, carrying the weight of the world. There was a long silence. No one uttered a word. No one moved. All knew that God in Jesus had been there. God too is a sufferer. He chose in Jesus to enter our painful world and suffer as a result of evil and give up his life on a cross. He grieves over this world and its brokenness. He cries over us. He struggles with our rebellion. So he knows suffering. And when we suffer, God suffers with us. He knows you deeply. He loves you desperately. And when he sees your pain, he knows what it is to suffer. He identifies with that pain. So Jesus is asking us in our suffering, and there are 5 things, and I'm sure that doesn't answer every question and all the rest, but I think it shows us where God is when it comes to suffering. And that Jesus asks us to trust him in our suffering. He may free us, and that's a wonderful hope that we have while we're in this world. He may free us from our suffering, and we'd love to pray for you for that. But even if he doesn't, even if he doesn't take it away, can you trust him in the middle of it? Can you hold on to him in the middle of it? Will you say, God, I don't understand what I'm going through, but I know you understand. And I know you're with me. And I know that you'll compensate me for this suffering. And I know that you can work through it. So I'm trusting you. I'm holding on to you. We're going to get the team to come back. I'm just going to pray for a moment, and then we're going to have communion together. Dear Jesus, I know that many people sitting here this morning have suffered far more than I have suffered. And Lord, I reach out for those, particularly those, Lord, that this morning are just feeling that the pain is so great in their lives, Lord. And I just pray that, Lord, in your grace, you'll come right alongside them. You understand it, Father, you understand. You hate it, and you understand. And so I pray, Lord, you'll come close right now, even now, Lord, as we come to this communion time. Lord, may your presence fill this place. May we know you as a suffering God who stands with us, who wants the best for us, who cares deeply for us. And Lord, that we can trust you even with the suffering that we have been through or that we're facing at the moment. So Lord, come close now as we share this time with you, I pray. Amen. We're going to have communion now. What we do in this church is every once a month or so we have communion together, and you should have received communion elements as you came in. If you haven't, just put up your hand and we'll get around and get some. Anyone need anything? Then Paul's going around. Thank you, Paul. What we do in communion is it's a time when we remember, and particularly we remember the suffering of Jesus. The bread, the wafer, represents the body of Jesus that was ripped apart for us. The cup represents the blood of Jesus that was poured out for us, freely poured out for us. And so as we celebrate this time, we celebrate the suffering of Jesus. And so I would like us to do that, to remember what Jesus has done, to thank him for it, to appreciate the deep suffering of our God and what that means for us, which is freedom. If you're not used to take communion, you don't need to take this, right? You can just listen. I'm going to sing a song for you, and you can just listen, and that would be fine as well. But if you feel free over this, the team's going to sing a song for you. It's about trusting God in our suffering. And while we do that, we're just going to be quiet. You can sing along if you want to, but you don't have to sing along. Just spend this time with God. Take any pain that you're feeling at the moment and bring it to God, or pain that you've had in the past that you feel maybe God hasn't been with you, and just bring it to God. Bring all that to God. And then take communion and just enjoy this time with a suffering God that cares deeply, deeply for you. Let's take communion together.